My name is Adrienne Dawes, she, her, and I wrote the play SCABS. Well, I think I was kind of always a writer, always interested in telling stories and incredibly shy growing up. So I was good at listening and paying attention to like the nuances and eccentricities of behavior and the way people speak and the way that they move. And that was something that translated early on as like poems and performance poetry because it was the 90s and it was a very big thing. But eventually I just became really taken with theater and nothing could really replace the, in the moment, ephemeral, never going to happen again, depending on the energy of the room and who was there. I just became so excited about that. And so I've been writing plays since high school. And I did undergrad at Sarah Lawrence and did a lot of theater and sociology and all different kinds of things. And then I just recently graduated with my MFA in theater this past May. So it's always kind of been in my life and always been something, a space where I felt like I could say what I wanted to say, find a community, have fun, and learn something new. Yes, yeah, and not just theater, but I'll focus on that because it's a little easier to easier in scope because there's so many. But
Yeah.
Susan Laurie Parks for me, I remember being 15 years old, seeing the America play, and it blew my mind. Like I had no idea that a play could be like that and feel like that and move like that. And so I was obsessed. I mean, I read as much as I could. I grew up in Austin, Texas, so there's a really cool sort of indie Austin theater community that's there. You're doing theater in your backyard. You're doing all different kinds of like the audiences there are so game for like whatever weird thing you want to throw at them, which is
Mm.
very cool. But there wasn't a whole lot, I would say, of like people doing work like Susan Laurie Park's work there. So yeah, she's kind of number one. Dale Orlando Smith, I really enjoy the poetry of her work. And Naomi Zuka, I was in a play of Naomi Zuka's when I was like 15, 16 years old. And again, that was another writer who I was like, I had no idea a play could be like this or that theater could feel like this. And so that those people are inspiring me for sure. Yeah, I write a lot. I would say identity is like the easy button answer. Like identity is always this slippery animal that is constantly changing and moving in these different ways. And I'm just fascinated by sort of the labels and boxes and how in this very binary way we look at all of these and really interesting intersections and complexities of the way that identity plays out over time in our present day. Like all of that's really fascinating to me. But the main themes are sort of about found family. Families are kind of show up
Mm.
a lot in my work, and then comedy for sure. There's a really strong sort of like using comedy as a way to talk about more serious subject matter.
Mm.
Yeah, there's something kind of very big and epic and sort of spectacle and campy about my work. But I'll say that like I feel like I know what I do now, or I feel like I know what I do well now, but I'm still open to figuring out other ways it can show up, if that makes sense.
When Octavia, a first time staff writer, immediately jumps to co executive producer on her second job after the 2023 WGA strike, her colleague Marie astutely suspects scab. This play is not sponsored by Fever Tree Ginger Beer and Minis, which very much speaks to the satire of the piece.
Yes.
Is Scabs is a very relevant piece, of course, in response to the this past writers strike that broke history. And when building the world of the show, did you ever think about ways that the time played a role in the piece, specifically between the relationships of the staff writers?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, yeah. It might be a play that has like an expiration date, which would be sad. And I know as writers, we think, or artists, we think our work is like evergreen and like will last the ages, but it is definitely talking about a very specific time and place. But I felt like some of the themes that were, number one, I I feel like this is just the beginning of sort of these, you know, labor complications. I feel like in my lifetime as an artist, I'm going to definitely go through this again. So am I appreciative that I've gone through it in the very beginning? Maybe. How many more? It's every contract's 3 years. I'm like, how much more are we going to be in this space, and how much are like the studios and the corporations actually going to be open to supporting their workers? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But yeah, I mean, I think some of the fun and some of the is like those details and like being very, very specific about a joke, being very, very specific about a reference. And understanding, that maybe not everyone understands that reference. So like, can they still have a good time? Can they still connect to the characters, even if they don't get word for word every joke or every cultural reference?
Yeah.
Yeah, and in speaking about characters, Adrienne, let's have a little bit into Octavia and Marie.
Yeah.
Just wanting to talk a little bit about sort of the key essence of what you were trying to establish with their relationship, in regards to the writer's room and sort of this overall conversation that we're currently speaking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting space as, a woman of color to, I think like another person of color in the room is like immediately my ally.
Mhm.
And in that sort of pressure cooker where it's incredibly competitive and yes, there's a lot of, I would say, solidarity and support, but there can also be just a lot of um competition or difficulty. Like you can't really assume someone is like trustworthy. You can't really assume what you say is going to be kept in confidence if you have a day where you're like, God, today was really, really hard. So I think I kind of wanted to talk about, have two writers of color who are like the same, sort of the same level, and then to have one sort of skyrocket to this other, you have to understand that in our structure, a co-EP is like right under the showrunner. They're like the number two. So this is kind of unheard of that like someone would go from like the very bottom to then all of a sudden shooting to the top. But then, there's some movement through the play that sort of breaks open what we know about everyone's status. That was fun to play with. But yeah, I think it's this complicated, you can have these like work friends where like, yes, there's admiration. Yes, there's you feel like there's a level of support there, but also there's such a hunger and it's like such a like, I have to do this to be able to survive. And I guess that was sort of, even though these characters are not, I like to think they're like really horrible, lovely people or funny people. Like there's things about them that are terrible. They're all kind of terrible, but they also, I feel like they're also in that drive and that movement towards gaining something. There's something that's humanizing about it. Like I understand the drive to try to succeed, to try to survive. Yes, the way they're going about is so messy and ridiculous and over the top, but underlying is like, look at the way this game is set up. And particularly for writers of color, look at how we're pitted against each other, look at how we're fighting for scraps. All of those things are like bubbling underneath. But yeah, it's fun to write about, to have like Black women in this sort of like comedic, opposing way. We see a lot of like, a BIPOC character versus a white character or something. And it's different to show like how, or I think it's interesting to show how we can be in the same sort of capitalist game and be pitted against each other in interesting ways.
Let's dive into the satire of this piece, in
Yeah.
terms of your use of satire in building sort of the nature of the play.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, I love comedy. It's kind of shows up in almost every play, whether I mean for it to or not. I like trained at Second City. I have this sort of like sketch comedy, improv, stand-up background is also like in the, gumbo pot of things that I do and I like and I draw inspiration from. And I just think it's a really easy, palatable vehicle for like a deeper conversation, like just to be able to disarm people and bust that open. It's like if I were to be like, we're going to talk today about racism in Hollywood, like I think you just immediately stiffen and you're sort of like, okay, I've seen that, I've heard that, I felt that, or like, I don't know, when you feel like you're being taught to or talked down to, it's totally different when you kind of have a different angle on it. So one of the greatest joys of this job is being able to make a complete stranger laugh. And when I can do that, not, I don't do it all the time, but when I can, I really love that. And I really love the idea of starting a conversation or something that might, for me, this idea that you would like go against a union. I'm such, I guess, maybe a rule follower that it would just never occur to me. You know, I joined the union right before the strike, and they're amazing. And I mean, they're so good about messaging like what we're fighting for. And I felt very like for it. But yeah, you go on those calls and it's primarily white people that are in leadership, you know, and there were, I remember there were other writers of color talking that our situation is a bit different. We're in a different arena. And there's great people making all these strides and doing really interesting things, but it's still different. And that was just so fascinating to think about, like, okay, what would it mean to break those rules, you know, knowingly, um, you know, for survival? Does this make sense? And is there a way that we can feel empathy for these characters, even though they are terrible? They are terrible. They're terrible people. But can we still find something we connect to, find something that we feel empathy for?
Yeah, and there's one section that we wanted to sort of pull out and sort
Yeah.
of highlight in terms of what you were just speaking about. It's the section between Marie and Octavia. Marie goes, you were out on the picket line all summer, and Octavia goes, outside in the summer. No, but how very ableist, Marie. Not every guild member can walk the picket line in Los Angeles. Some are in Santa Barbara and use wheelchairs. And Marie flatly says, I'm sorry, Octavia, didn't realize you were disabled.
Yeah, yeah, that one's really and this would really because this is a play again that's never been in front of an audience. So that's definitely a section where I would be in the audience as the writer, like feeling out like, can we
For
do this?
sure. Yeah.
Because you know, I don't know if we can, but I think it speaks to like how horrible they are. That, like, I mean, I also love the crip camp joke that she's like, oh, I learned about disability rights from crip camp. I think that's pretty hilarious. And I know a lot of people who, in their sort of woke opinion, or regardless of race, but or gender, whatever, they're like, they're so in this like, I have to be PC, I have to be woke, I have to be this activist in all these ways, but maybe don't understand the ways the what they're doing or what they're saying is actually quite harmful or actually like way off base and inappropriate. So yeah, that was just a little fun.
And speaking of Ursula, she is sort of like the fish eye perspective of the whole thing
Yeah,
and an outsider but insider perspective. Um,
yeah.
and in the sense of hierarchy that is established in this room, how does this specific perspective play into this sort of like puzzle piece of the writer's room?
Yeah, I mean, our assistants, which are wonderful. I feel like anyone that knew me in my room should know that like some of my favorite people were our assistants and the PA and the showrunner's assistant. Like they work so hard and they really don't get paid like hardly anything. And that's often if you're trying to get your way into, like, I lucked out in, like, I was a playwright and I had a rep who just sort of like snuck me in. And my first job was definitely based around identity. I was the adopted writer. It was a play that, or sorry, it was a TV show that was about adoption. And all of my siblings and I are adopted. And then I'm the one non-disabled sibling, and everyone else in my family is disabled in terms of my siblings. So I was coming there with that sort of perspective because that's what the story was kind of talking about. But for the vast majority of people trying to break in, they're starting as assistants. And yes, you have assistants who actually come from these, like, who are Nepo babies. They come from, you know, their uncle was this person and then they like landed this job. And so they're an interesting, and what an interesting journey that must be too, because if you are a really talented storyteller and you just so happens that your mom is super famous, like that must also be like a really weird of like trying to prove yourself, but also move up in that space. But they're kind of like, you know, I mean, I think in a bad situation, not my room, but in a bad situation, they're really can be disregarded and just like scenery, you know what I mean? That like the writers might not even pay attention to them or like talk to them. But in my room, we were always like, we were talking about White Lotus and like sharing jokes and what are the best restaurants. Like it was a much more sort of collaborative space. But yeah, they have a really hard job. And in that hierarchy of the play, they're at the very bottom. And that's why it was fun to give them a twist.
Mm.
Um, somewhere in the play, I will not divulge.
Yeah, and I do love just that the character of Ursula though doesn't have as many lines. It's such a full developed character. Um and just from like the facial expressions and everything, it's like you really put thought into that as well, which exactly as you said plays into the hierarchy perfectly.
I'll say that like I definitely, as a baby playwright growing up, I had this moment where I was like, I don't have to center stories around white people. I don't
Mhm.
have to try to teach them anything or explain myself. I can just tell the stories I want to tell. And it was really, it's stupid to say that out loud because of course, and I knew that on one level, but I remember there was this moment where I was like, I'm really always going to focus, and that's kind of true across my plays, is like typically a Black woman who's at the center of the story, or Black and Latina or Latina woman. That's kind of that sort of femme identity is like usually the centerpiece
Mhm.
of what I do, and everything else kind of falls around that. But the idea is to tell a great story at the end of the day.